What follows is free. But if you want to see the full extent of what we do and get involved, go to patreon.com/word in your ear. Now, on with the show.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear, and to someone we've been reading in private eye for 33 years. Now, I often look at the endorsements on book jackets and think that's pitching it a bit high, or someone's getting a bit overexcited here. But the quotes on his new book, Haywire, are absolutely on the money. Our greatest living satirist and the wittiest writer in Britain today. Absolutely correct, and it's so lovely to see him. Craig Brown, fantastic. How are you?
Very nice, because actually when I put those on the covers, but I do feel slightly fraudulent. I can think of lots of funnier people, but anyway, that's
not remotely, and we're quite sure no money changed hands. So no, the last time you were on, we were talking about your fantastic Beatles book, 1, 2, 3, 4. Very quickly before we start on Haywire, you've seen subsequently, of course, Get Back has come out. So we wondered what you thought of that, and if that gave you any new insights or impressions of what the Beatles were like and how they worked.
Yes, I think. I mean, there was so much of interest in it. I think one of the interesting things, because it was so long, because it was 8 hours or whatever.
Yeah,
you saw something which no documentary on any subject has ever done before. You saw sort of real life going on, and in all its drabness. And so you had these 4 people who are the most glamorous people in the world. And they were just sitting around waiting for cups of coffee, waiting for other people
toast
late, making toast,
yeah.
Feeling hungover, and so that's rather fascinating just to see. I mean, in a funny way, it was like I got rather hooked on the Queen's lying in state because there was a live feed. I don't know if you saw that. And I said to friends, who had no interest in the monarchy, if you just watch this for 10 minutes, you'll be hooked. And that was, in a way, real life. I mean, it was in the same way as Abbey Road. It was a very peculiar version of real life, but it was just seeing people queuing and then seeing what they do in private before this coffin. Anyway, so Get Back had some slight echoes of the lying in state.
No, it did. The new book is, it's a book reviews. It's a greatest hits, really, isn't it? It's book reviews, private eye columns, newspaper columns, essays, and there's a lovely bit in the intro where you say, "In the glare of the internet, the border has been blurred between true and false, authentic and concocted, nutcase and expert." And I just wondered if, as a columnist, the social media and the internet has made life easier. Actually, that there's just more opportunity to write about extraordinary things.
I mean, it's certainly easier for research. I mean, like I did a column which is out today. I wrote it yesterday, but I wanted to make this this link between John le Carré. John le Carré's lover previously was engaged to Jeremy Lloyd, who wrote "Are You Being Served?" And Jeremy Lloyd had been married to Joanna Lumley, and Joanna Lumley had gone out with Rod Stewart and Eleanor Stewart, with George Hamilton, who seems to have gone out with Imelda Marcos, and so and so I was making this kind of sexual conga line, and obviously the internet is really good at that. You've got to be careful of your sources, obviously, because there's lots of bonkers things, but you can do research very, very swiftly in a way you couldn't before. You'd have to go to a library or ring lots of people up. So that's very good. But also, I mean, I suppose it is making the world crazier, the internet, and 24-hour news and everything. I mean, you can see it with this whole Liz Truss meltdown. It's slightly driven by 24-hour news because anyone can be on the news at any time. And these hundreds of news sources are desperate for conservative backbenchers and all that kind of thing. So it just speeds up life, and it makes it more, well, the title of the book is Haywire, makes everything more haywire. And of course, satirists are always, in a way, on the side of things going wrong. And so, it's golden years for satirists.
So I'm fascinated by the story you just told, Jeremy Lloyd and John le Carré's lover and so forth. Because one of the things that struck me reading the book, I was reminded of reading the book, you must be a huge reader of diaries.
Yeah.
You're doing that all the time, are you? Go on.
I've got lots of diaries. In a way, it's the best sort of. I've got a lot of books, and the most sort of complete collection within those books is diaries. I reviewed books for about, well, really been reviewing since I was 20, but once a week for 23 years. So I'd always home in on diaries. If there was diaries on offer, I'd always get them. And in some ways, they can be boring to read. Even, Pepys's diaries a lot of it's boring, but in the same way I was saying about Get Back, that it's real life.
Yeah. And
also, and diarists record things like rumors and gossip, and historians just don't. So I think diarists get much closer to the sort of weft, if that's the word, of real life than historians do.
But it's wonderful in the way I think you write a piece in here about John Stonehouse, the famous disappearing postmaster general. And I think you throw in quite early on, he disappeared. He was well known for disappearing. Barbara Castle's diaries talk about him disappearing. You obviously read all these diaries, and you just hold one little nugget. And somehow it comes in years later.
No, I wish I had. I don't have a very good memory, actually. But the great thing about most books, but not mine, is that they have indexes. And so I wanted to write. I'd been sent a book by John Stonehouse's older daughter, who I never met. I met the other two children and his wife. And it was a great defense of John Stonehouse. It just came out beginning of this year. Oh, no, it must have been last year. And because I'd known John Stonehouse, I thought, well, that, I kind of brought myself in. And he's a fascinating figure. So then it's very interesting to see what he had risen sort of quite high, being Postmaster General. And so he is in Crossman's diaries, Barbara Castle's diaries. There's a slight kind of walk-on part, but it's interesting to see what people thought of him before he disappeared.
Yeah, definitely.
Castle, who was a very intelligent woman, she obviously got some sense of this disappearing figure.
I love that. I
wanted to ask a bit about the you write about a lot of comedians, wonderful entries, Tommy Cooper and Benny Hill, Marx Brothers, and there's a sort of pattern that emerges with a lot of them, that they're quite odd, eccentric people from very peculiar backgrounds. Did you get any kind of insights into what drives people to want that level of attention and to want to make people laugh to that extent?
I think sometimes, like with Frankie Howerd and Kenneth Williams, it comes from people laughing at them.
Yeah.
And them wanting to kind of own the laughter. And because they both also, once they've become very successful, very famous, they had a kind of self-loathing to them, especially Kenneth Williams, who was...
Yes, he did.
Who would entertain... his diaries are completely fascinating, because he'd be on Just a Minute or on a Parkinson show, and everyone would be roaring with laughter and applauding him and adoring him. And then he'd go home just full of self-loathing at what he's just done, because I think he hated his facility for making people...
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things with really funny comedians. They have this facility and they don't really trust it. They don't know where it comes from. And they think, well, if I worked harder, I could be something else. Like Kenneth Williams, who had started with not the RSC, but, doing relatively smart parts with Maggie Smith and that kind of thing. He then became Carry On person, and he hated it. He was a kind of highbrow in a way.
Yeah.
He hated being a lowbrow or being seen as a lowbrow. And so I think quite a lot of those old style comedians is to do with self-hatred. And of course, with both of those, they were gay at a time it was illegal to be gay.
Yeah.
And I think nowadays there isn't any of that terrible inversion which comes with the old comedians. They were hiding something and they were neurotic about it. And then it emerged as humor. But now, thankfully all that's gone. But I think the comedy is maybe less sort of driven and maybe less funny.
I couldn't help thinking, I was reading the Kenneth Williams thing this morning, and you reminded us, I think he died in 1988, is that right? It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And yet, the point you make is he's still very vivid in our memories, isn't he? Because
it's odd, because someone like David Frost, who died much more recently, completely forgotten figure. It's almost hard to conjure up in that way, he's like...
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah.
Caring man. Whereas Kenneth Williams, he didn't, and he wrote these brilliant diaries, but all these things that he's famous for, like infamy, he's got it infamy. They were written by Talbot Rothwell, I think his name was. And so he's not actually known for these sort of Oscar Wilde aphorisms or anything, but he's just known because he had this very, very kind of vivid, weird personality. And I think people are intrigued by that.
Yes, absolutely. We must ask about the Private Eye diaries, because there's some lovely examples of that you've quoted in the book. There's the Blair one and the Tim Peake one. I mean, I always imagine that you must have a list where a little short list where you're compiling a list of people who are evolving into possible future targets, and you're waiting for them to get big enough or do something ludicrous enough to write about. Is that right? I mean,
yes, no, there are a few people I wish were more famous who sort of get on my nerves, but it would just be self-indulgent to put them in. They tend to have it feels all journalism is much better if it's topical. And so, I mean, if I did Tim Peake, people have probably forgotten Tim Peake as well, but he's the first British astronaut.
Yeah.
If I did him now, it would seem really odd. People would think, well, why are you doing it now? So you have to, do that kind of
at the time.
And even if I did, I mean, I have done Tony Blair sort of since he left power, but it was a joke about being powerless. And I think it'd be odd to do him now. It'd even be odd to do Boris Johnson now. I mean,
yes, he would.
Things move on very quickly.
So do you research that like a cartoonist does in a way? Kind of, you're watching endless bits of video, YouTube, and looking for speech idiosyncrasies, or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I do that. I think it's very much language driven. So, like with Liz Truss, I noticed the way she speaks is for some reason she pauses every third word, and then with sort of Australian inflection, and then that's quite funny if you put that as a full stop in the middle of a sentence. And so there are sort of tricks you can play with, but I think language is always very revealing, and especially if I'm parodying in an actual diary in the Private Eye diaries. Alan Clark's diaries or something. Well, I'd say, I mean, if I was doing Jacob Rees-Mogg, you just have to see that. I watch quite a lot of YouTubes, read his. I wouldn't read the whole of his very, very boring book about Victorians, but you get that kind of pompous style. I mean, it's quite an easy one to copy. In a way, he's a copy of himself, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
People sort of retreated into some kind of self.
Do you ever run into people, if you go to, I don't know, Cheltenham Festival or something, you must be surrounded by people that you have parodied. Do people ever come up to you and had a reaction,
Well, usually, if you're avoiding people, people are avoiding you. I was hoping that.
Yeah, that's very good.
And there are worse things. I was thinking this morning for some reason, though, if you do a bad review of someone, it tends to be much more in your face. I mean, much more difficult to laugh off. And when I was, there's a review in the book of Bruce Robinson's book about Jack the Ripper.
Which is incredible. He comes up with this extraordinary idea. He spent £500,000 researching this book.
Yeah, and I did know Bruce Robinson a bit. We were once sort of guests. We got a mutual friend, and we were both sort of house guests.
Yeah,
I reviewed the book about maybe 2 years later, and then very soon after, and I did him in Private Eye. And he is quite a kind of, I don't know if you know him.
I met him, yes, yeah, he's fantastic.
He's quite a sort of random kind of character. And by chance, I'd just been walking with friends along Offers Dyke, and stopped at Hay on Wye, so not during the book festival. We were in a restaurant there, and it was just a few weeks after the review and the parody had come out. And I was suddenly a very small restaurant with just 6 tables in a row. I was at one end of the row, and then I suddenly saw Bruce Robinson and his wife at the table 6 along. I thought, how am I going to get out of here? Because he's the kind of person who wouldn't just avoid it.
No, not at all. No, he's quite confrontational.
So we just had to wait until they left first. I once had that also with Michael Winner, who I'd made jokes about. I think perhaps we were both reviewing restaurants. Anyway, we were in the same hill. And rather pathetically, because I should be able to stand up for myself, I asked if I could leave by the kitchen, and so I went through the swing doors of the. But usually that was some time ago. These days, if people want to object, they can.
Yeah.
But obviously, I think, as politicians, say Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I've done a slightly disgusting parody of in the book, with his nanny changing his nappies while he reads the Financial Times.
She peels his boiled egg for him, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Age 55, he hasn't learned how to do that. Yeah.
But I suspect politicians, by and large, are very robust because they've had to go through all these humiliating processes of being adopted as the candidate and then facing election and then being on Newsnight and all that kind of thing. And so I guess that actually I was, oddly enough, in a room with Jacob Rees. I was at a launch party about 2 weeks ago. He was the other end, so he wouldn't have known I was there. And but I guess he'd just said, "Oh, most amusing," or something like that.
Yeah.
Whether he would think that or not is another question. But I don't think he'd come up and punch you.
No, I think he avoids that kind of thing. Actually, I think he's probably very good at dealing with that kind of thing. I was very taken by the kind of serious stuff in this book. Because it's not just a book of humor; it's the best of Craig Rounds, all kinds of things. Yeah. And I was particularly taken with your piece about Arthur Lowe.
Oh yes, it's really moving. Yeah,
just tell us a little bit about that. Because it was based on a book written by his son. Is that right?
I think his son did write a book. I think this was some other book. I've got a bad memory for that. I actually, when I was compiling the book, and I was just choosing the bits which sort of struck me as saying something new or original or something, and discarding ones which seemed out of date. But when I finally assembled it, and then I was doing the audio book, and I thought, God, I thought this was a kind of frothy book, but it's actually
it's not
gloomy. At least a third, probably a half, a kind of quite sort of serious, as you say, it's kind of gloomy. Especially in a way the comedians. Arthur Lowe didn't have as unhappy a life as, say, someone like Kenneth Williams or Frankie Howerd. But he was, he was. And the interesting thing about him was, Dad's Army went on for a lot longer than the Second World War. I say 10 years compared to 6 years. And if you're in one of those long-running series, the writers start writing your own character into your character, the actor's character into the character they're playing, and so they melded. By the end, Arthur Lowe and Captain Mannering were virtually the same person, and that's not to say he wasn't a brilliant actor, because he had this very kind of invisible form of acting, which usually only Americans can do. You couldn't see him at work as an actor, but he was kind of bossy on set and wanted and very sort of prim and proper and that kind of thing. And then of course that sort of caught him. He played it probably for too long. He did. His wife had been an actress, and when rather touchingly, when he retired from Dad's Army, he was he was incredibly good stage actor. He was on a lot of the Lindsay Anderson films and plays. But he rather saddled himself with his wife, because he insisted his wife should appear on stage with him. So whenever he was offered a part, he'd say, "Only if my wife can play, a maid or something, not a key part." But and then she would sometimes fall over on stage. She was a bit of a drinker, and so actually, what could have been a kind of glorious retirement was rather a subdued retirement in provincial theatres.
Yeah. The impression I get reading all the stuff about entertainers, and you write a terrific piece about Bruce Springsteen, based on his autobiography, and that gathered together all these entertainers. They're all really strange, aren't they? They're all kind of disturbed in some way, aren't they?
I think the you know more about rock than I do, but I think the interesting thing with and it came out in the Dylan book, and almost all the honest rock autobiographies is that they are very driven and they're very, very organised. Like David Bowie, this sort of airy-fairy figure. He was very, very driven. He'd sack people, and it's sort of ruthless. And I think, and Springsteen is the one who most acknowledges his own ruthlessness. There's that marvelous bit where he his band are a few seconds late on stage because they've been playing table tennis backstage, and he bans table tennis.
Absolutely,
yes.
And you think, good old Brucey, but he's still this person. He is the band leader, and of course you need that because you can't have a band of 10 people or however many he has.
I liked your theories about Keith Richards, which I think I subscribe to, because your theory is that Mick Jagger is the beating heart of the Rolling Stones, and without him they would be, I don't know, virtually on the pub circuit, and that Keith is a bit of a bore and a bit of a fraud, really. Is that?
Yes, I'm glad you agree, because I feel that people were taken in by that book. I mean, I say that he's a kind of Bertie Wooster figure because he's lived in the same house, very conservative, but probably more so than Charlie Watts, and Charlie Watts at least made a thing about it.
Yeah.
In the same house since about 1967 or so.
Yeah.
Most of us have moved house or done something. And then he gets an old Etonian to write his autobiography for him. He's just, and I think doesn't he have a great library of sort of war books or history?
He does.
And he potters around, and Anita Pallenberg used to come and clip his hedges for him.
That's right. And
I just think that without Mick, who he's very rude about in his the Rolling Stones just would, I mean, they are effectively a covers band covering themselves, but they would they'd be like the Baron Knights or something, swinging blue jeans. But he's managed his amazing trick without having had a hit for say 40 years. Amazing trick of making them the most largest money making band in the world.
Yes.
And can you imagine Keith getting around to that?
No,
well, all bands have to have one member who says, "Let's do this."
Yeah.
And that's always
all the others can moan about it.
And they can always
agree with it.
Paul is the same.
Same thing.
And of course, everyone then hates it. And
absolutely.
Paul is now coming back into fashion, but basically, it seems so un-rock and roll to be the pushy one. The fans all say, "Oh no, I much prefer John or Keith," because they're much more like the fans. They're lazing around. Feeling resentful. So it's an interesting dynamic, and probably it is true of every successful band.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Driver,
So, what's your favourite? What's your favourite piece in this book? It's full of all sorts of wonderful things.
Well, I suppose the thing is I think I like there's a parody of In Our Time. I like unfashionable targets. And I mean, obviously, I can see. I'm really glad that In Our Time is still going and that people get something from it. But it is completely impenetrable, and you feel that Melvyn Bragg has got these, three academics who are kind of like wild horses, all trying to pull in their own direction, some going too fast forward, some going too far back, and he's always trying to say, well, if I can just return you to this, and so it is parodiable. So I've performed that a couple of times with friends, and
constantly reminding you that it's an intellectual debate, isn't it? It's all very rarefied.
But I basically like the ones that I haven't read for a bit, so I can sort of read them afresh. And there's a longer piece. I'm not sure I'd say it's one of the greatest, but there's a longer piece about the nature of biography, which has some kind of chunky, meaty sort of stuff in it. And I quite like, I noticed, which slightly surprised me as well, that quite a lot of mine are against atheism, not quite sort of pro-religion, but there's such a sort of, like with Keith Richards, there's such a sort of, the fashionable tide is so atheist, and isn't Christopher Hitchens cool, or Richard Dawkins? And I like those. I realised that the artists I like, the painters like Stanley Spencer and David Jones, all have a kind of spiritual side. So I like, in a way, that's going against the grain, and I like the pieces which are going against the grain and say, hey, but there is something. There's something beyond the here and now. And the smugness of Richard Dawkins vastly outweighs any smugness of, say, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
That's true.
Yeah, true. That's good.
And the certainty, his certainty, are fundamentalist certainties. And so I like those.
Yeah, you also write about Tony Benn's dreams, don't you? They say that Tony Benn spent most of his life being certain about everything, except when he was asleep.
Well, I think dreams. I mean, dreams are so fascinating. Whenever especially if you're sort of going to sleep, when you're slipping into sleep, you realize you're at any time being awake, you're 30 seconds away from madness, because you slip into sleep and then for some reason you wake up and you think, my God, I was occupying this completely crazy
parallel world.
And you see how your mind, your sanity is so sort of hanging by a thread all the time. And I think, and it was very, because Tony Benn he wrote an entry every day for say 60 years, 70 years, maybe. That's 60 years anyway. And so he did, though it was mainly boring TUC meetings and that kind of thing, he would actually put in his dreams, and he'd be mystified by his own dream. And so at one point I thought, it did take a rather long time, but go through all these millions of words of diaries looking for his dreams. But they are kind of revealing, because this man who was so like Dawkins, but in another way, so full of certainties, is actually, his whole being is so close to uncertainty.
Fantastic stuff.
It is.
So it's all there. The book is Haywire, the best of Craig Brown. Out now.
Thoroughly recommended.
Can I ask you both a quiz question, which I...
Go on. Yeah, go on.
With. Do you remember the band Lieutenant Pigeon?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Mouldy old dough.
Okay, they call themselves Lieutenant Pigeon because it was an anagram of something. Oh, what was the anagram?
Oh my goodness.
That's good. This is probably in What's-Its book. In Will Hodgkinson's book, he's bound to have a chapter about Lieutenant Pigeon.
Oh, I haven't seen that. Yeah,
it's all about sing-along pop.
I'll tell you something frightening that I saw as well. What I saw is the very old woman. Do you remember there was an old woman on the...
Yeah, she played piano. She was the mother of a member of the group, I think.
But she was 58, so she could...
I know.
When that was... So she could have been, Mick Jagger's daughter at that time.
Yeah.
Shall I tell you what it is?
Yes, go on.
Go on.
It's Genuine Potential.
Oh, okay.
Sadly, I'm not sure they did have genuine potential.
No. How did you discover that? Where did you come across that?
I can't remember. I read it somewhere. And I did work it. I mean, I checked that it was correct. Yeah.
Oddly enough, they probably did make some money out of that, because they owned that, didn't they?
Yeah. Wasn't it a #1 record? It
was big all over, I think,
You can watch it on YouTube, them on Top of the Pops. It's fascinating, right? Yeah. I think they were an experimental band called Stavely Make.
Yes, they were.
That's right, they were.
There is a story like that. Yes.
Yeah. It's a bit like Hot Legs with Neanderthal Man. It seems like a kind of simple throwaway song, but it was to them.
And isn't it one of those rare examples of a song where I think that's the only lyric? Isn't that the only lyric? Mouldy old dough.
Yes, I don't think they hardly say that. There's a band going, whoa.
Mouldy old dough. That's right.
Chinky,
brilliant.
Pub piano. Yeah,
You've got to give them some points for that. Fantastic.
I think.